Before coronavirus, there was another, so far more deadly epidemic which first impacted on Western consciousness in the early 1980s. It manifested originally in the US amongst gay men. Although the homophobic slur that it was therefore a gay plague has since long been discounted, at the time it prompted all kinds of socially conservative moralizing and demonizing. This was very isolating for that community when it was already going through the trauma of death. Michael Lopez, in his 2018 play The Inheritance, reflects on the impact of thousands of deaths in the gay community in New York. It was a collective trauma for that community. All kinds of considerations had to be borne in mind, including how does one express intimacy? How does one express love in these difficult circumstances? Could even a kiss cause an infection, which all too often proved fatal? It was a trauma that at first isolated the community more, reinforced by the demonization within the wider society, a demonization which is referenced in Keith Haring's famous 1989 poster that we can see in this slide. Yet Haring's poster also speaks to the activism that he was a part of that responded to this isolation, and that was also in due course to transform, at least in the West, the position of these gay communities within officialdom and within their wider society. The legal status of these gay communities in Western society had been partially improving in the decades before the 1980s. So, for instance, in Britain, gay sex between men was partially decriminalised in 1987. But the 1980s also saw a reassertion of hostility to what was seen as not normal, particularly in the form of Section 28 in Britain of the Local Government Act 1987, a piece of legislation introduced in the face of a moral panic about our children learning how to be gay, in response to concerns about the appearance of gay literature in some schools. In practice, Section 28 was largely a empty piece of legislation which had limited effect on a more or less non-existent problem. However, it was a symbolic act, and it galvanized activism to respond in reaction to it, in the same way that the impact of AIDS and the way in which AIDS was being handled by the authorities was also producing gay activism. For the purposes of this slide, however, the most significant aspect of Section 28 is what it says about what is deemed to be normal within a society. It reflects a construction that there is a normal, in inverted commas, way of engaging and that this is to be discouraged, to be closeted, to be confined to gay enclaves within cities, devant les enfants, as it were, not in front of the children. And that's very much what Section 28 was about, as if you could somehow teach people to be gay, whereas it might be argued that what in practice has happened in the period since the 19th century is that a heterosexual norm has been imposed upon societies that in the course of the 19th century became in the West became terribly animated by the need to maintain the quality of the stock, to maintain the population, and to these eugenicist insights, if you like, and thereby to reduce the extent to which people did not participate in heterosexual forms of behaviour. Not being, as Armistead Maupin puts it in his stories of gay San Francisco in the 1980s onwards, a breeder was to fail in your duty to the nation. Such perspectives were reinforced by moral guardians such as religious organisations. They were embedded in the writings of the developing analysis of sex and sexual behaviours in the late 19th century, and they were exported, as we can see from the graphic on this slide, by European powers to their colonial empires in the form, for instance, of the prohibition on homosexuality introduced by the British in India in 1861. This framework of heteronormativity, reinforced by sometimes savage policing and indeed by various legal prohibitions on expressions of non-heterosexual forms of sexual behaviour, which in much of the US, for instance, included prohibitions on cross-dressing, was something which therefore had a countervailing impact upon the gay community, even after the first moves towards a less closeted existence were starting to occur. In both the US and the UK in the 1950s, activists, we can call them such, were at pains to stress the respectability of what Peter Wildeblood in his testimony to the Wolfenden Report on homosexuality and street offences in 1950s Britain termed the good homosexual. The stress was on reducing the persecution that these good homosexuals experienced, these straight-acting homosexuals, if you like, experienced as a result of being lumped in with the queers, the pansies, the fags, the drag queens, and so on, who were clearly outside the pale of respectable heterosexual society. That quietist approach remained embedded in large numbers of people. Indeed, to some extent, it's still there, of course, which is why in some of the first incidents you see of people fighting back against the persecution of the police, such as the Cooper Donuts riot. It's a fairly small affair, but nonetheless, in Los Angeles in 1959, it's transvestites and transsexuals who are responding to over-heavy policing. Resistance to that kind of policing was also central to what happened in Stonewall in New York in 1969, which led to the start of Pride, what is now called Pride marches, as commemorations and indeed as protests against this kind of brutality, which is why it closets to outcry, because it's about moving beyond the idea of the good homosexual who can somehow pass within heterosexual society to actually deciding this is not about allowing a section of the community to pass, but being able to respond to something which impacts more broadly upon the gay community, particularly when it's something as indiscriminate as AIDS, which is the point being made here by Gregory Woods. The indiscriminate nature of AIDS is what leads to the difference in reproach between the older gay actor, Sir Alec Guinness, and the younger gay actor depicted here, Ian McKellen, on a march against Section 28 in 1988, because there is no meaningful discrimination as the 1980s wear on between the good and the bad in view of wider society, homosexual. The virus which impacted upon the gay community in this way, and I should say I'm using the term gay community as a convenient shorthand, although I'm conscious that it is a problematic and, in the time we're talking about, possibly an anachronistic term, with lots of divisions within it. But if I can use it as a shorthand to address the groups, particularly among gay men, who are impacted by the arrival of this killer disease. In a timeline of the impact of this, you might argue that it starts off as a silent epidemic. Firstly, because the medical science takes some time to pinpoint exactly what it is. Things don't move as fast as they have with coronavirus. So although there's some research going on in the US, in the Centre for Disease Control in the 1970s, they're looking at it as a syndrome which occurs in the Congo, and it's not seen as being something which is of immediate concern to Americans, even when the first Americans start dying of it. From 1981 onwards, silence is the appropriate word in another way, that the CDC has still less the Reagan administration, do not speak about or to this syndrome. One researcher talks about being urged to make it look like you were doing things without really doing anything terribly substantial. Because the virus was seen as impacting primarily on various groups, most of whom were not exactly the most popular with the majority population, it did not attract the popularity or the funding that COVID has done. Instead, as we can see from the picture here, what you had was demonisation and a relative absence of funding. It's only when Ronald Reagan's fellow film star and friend Rock Hudson died of AIDS that the president even mentions the disease, as it was widely, if erroneously, referred to as a virus which attacks the immune system. It's only thereafter that the first treatments, effective treatments, really come in. Up until this point, up until the late 1980s, essentially a lot of what's happening is community activism. 1987 seems to be a turning point, and in terms of the view of wider society, and a turning point for the West in terms of survival rates is achieved with the advent of the so-called AIDS cocktail in 1996. And you can follow up on these by looking at the interactive timelines attached to this slide. Activists rejected the public health professionals' standard procedure approach. Quarantine and isolation of already stigmatized and isolated individuals was a problem when you were talking about people who were already alienated from their families. When they were dying, this alienation would be reinforced. They would be all too often cut off from their loved ones by those same homophobic families. Boyfriends had no immediate legal claim on their dying lovers. This led activist groups to demand access to better health and access for loved ones, as well as research. This understanding of activism was also able to use changing understanding of the syndrome. What had briefly been known as gay-related immunodeficiency disease in 1982 shifted as it was identified in 1983, and as it became clear that women and children could also catch it. As Alan Whiteside put it in 2010, the realization that HIV could spread to the general public and that it was linked to the life-giving intercourse resulted in increased hysteria. Governments, the media and scientists sought a quick response. A sense of urgency defined the problem. Even as information about modes of transmission became more accurate, the original fear and stigma prevailed. The gay rights movement, Whiteside goes on to point out, built on this momentum. that it had gained in the previous decades, and campaigned for HIV/AIDS to be viewed as a human rights issue. Advocates argued that infection was not the only risk. If found positive, individuals also faced harmful discrimination. In this, the activists were supported by public health officials who feared that stigma would prevent those at risk from getting tested, and that those infected would then similarly not access health services. Stigma stops this happening, and in a case of a disease, that's really not a good thing. Avoiding compulsory measures such as isolation and quarantine was all the more crucial then, since the people that they were looking at who had the increased risk, gay and bisexual men, drug users and their sexual partners, were already socially vulnerable and socially stigmatized. Policies and practices that appeared to threaten such people could only drive the epidemic underground and make it more difficult to work with the populations within which HIV was spreading and then coming out to attack the wider population as well. This AIDS exceptionalism finally produced a response from the Reagan administration, the setting up of a commission to look into the AIDS epidemic, and a much greater amount of investment in this particular crisis. In the process, however, certain things are worth focusing on. The way in which biomedical research responded to the kinds of concerns that activists were bringing to them. How do you do research with a population who are so stigmatized anyway? Secondly, the way in which the research focused upon certain populations rather than others, and arguably more on gay white men, whereas it is among gay African Americans that you have still the highest rate of AIDS in the US. Indeed, it's sometimes argued this is the highest rate of infections of Africans anywhere in the world, partly because of relatively low access to medical insurance and the relatively high cost of these drugs in the US. The other point that this slide is drawing attention to is the way in which the impact of AIDS changed the experiences of the gay community more broadly. The crisis, it can be argued, led to the invention of safe sex in the form of the guide we can see on the slide here to having sex in an epidemic. This publication in 1983 both reflected the community reacting to the crisis that was engulfing them, the processes whereby they were re-evaluating how to manage intimacy in these very difficult circumstances. It also, to some extent, redefined for the wider public what a good homosexual was. One who wears a condom. The extent to which there was a reappraisal that followed on immediately from the AIDS crisis of the place of the gay community within this wider heteronormative society should not be exaggerated. Kay Wellings, pictured here, found that when she worked at the health education unit in the UK, there was pressure put on to modify their findings and to not express all of the things they found for fear of upsetting social norms. Indeed, this led to her concluding that the AIDS crisis led and fanned a pent-up moral repression. A moral repression which was expressed in a continuing tendency to for gay people to be killed, or even in the comedy set in Australia, Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, extended process of queering Australian uber masculinities. You have this scene where on the side of their bus, AIDS fuckers go home has been painted. Clearly, we shouldn't exaggerate the transformation of public attitudes. 2 years before Freddie Mercury died in 1991 of symptoms related to AIDS, a majority of people in America took the view that people should be isolated. 42% thought that gay bars should be closed. The image of contagion, the image of the gay community being diseased, of course, didn't originate with AIDS, so these attitudes were simply able to play upon long-standing tropes within the homophobia in the wider community. Whilst at the same time, the community itself was devastated by the way in which their friends were, as the quote says here, dropping like flies. At the time, it did not seem that attitudes to the gay community were therefore changing. Indeed, around the time of Section 28, in 1987, when the Thatcher government were issuing scary anti-AIDS information leaflets, 2/3 of the UK population saw gay relations as always wrong. This was partly a generational thing, but it was also something which was hugely isolating, and these views were even more marked among religious groups. Since 1987, however, there was, at least until 2018, a steady trend towards less homophobia among all sections of the community, including religious ones. So 1987 appears to be something of a caesura. So why do we see this slow shift from then? As this slide suggests, there are a number of reasons, and of course this is talking about the Canadian setting, but it's still relevant for attitudes within, if you like, the Anglophone world. First, activists came out of the closet, but also came to be seen as humans rather than as unknown stereotypes, just labelled as gay. And the more people who came out all were outed by AIDS, like Rock Hudson, the more this was the case. Gays were no longer unknown and feared. 2. The system, like the public health officials discussed earlier, had to interact with a community frequently excluded by stigma from accessing medical services. And this also tended to humanise their experience. 3. The resulting battles led to an assertion of gay rights. 4. Along the way, this started to usualise people, and that's the term I tend to use rather than, because normalising suggests that there is a norm like heteronormativity. There is a structure to which we should all conform. Usualising is to suggest actually human beings are really diverse, but we should accept that we all are part of that rich mix of humanity. So in the West, what we've been presenting is a view that the AIDS crisis paradoxically contributes to greater acceptance of gay lives, whilst revealing disturbing hierarchies in treatment which continue to disadvantage BME sufferers. Similar hierarchies and misguided narratives around transmission also inhibited even more treatment in Africa, where the virus started. These were there exacerbated by a whole range of factors, including the determination of many policymakers to frame homosexuality as both unnatural and un-African, a reading which ignores the way in which the early modern Europeans who came to Africa observed the prevalence of gay relations in the populations they interacted with. Un-African then, as with the framing of the heteronormative concept that we started off this lecture with, is a product of 19th century colonial attitudes. Such frameworks have helped to produce far more deaths than might otherwise have been the case, as well as the continuing oppression of LGBTQ plus people in many African states. In this, and in the determination to express a post-colonial independence from those Western countries who are perhaps pinkwashing in an attempt to proclaim their liberalism in the world, we see AIDS and LGBTQ people being victims of, or AIDS sufferers and LGBTQ people being victims of African identity politics. In 2018, the latest year for which we have figures, half of the people living with AIDS, 19.2 million, are in East and Southern Africa, exactly those areas most affected by the policy-making attitudes just described. We should note as well that by far the highest number of new infections is also in the same region, with another 6.1 million AIDS sufferers in West and Central Africa. In that same year, 17% of the new infections were the result of gay male sex, 24% involved sex workers, and 46% involved what in statistics is just called the remaining population, with young women in sub-Saharan Africa particularly at risk. The one consolation is that of the 38 million now living with AIDS, 23.3 million are receiving antiretroviral treatment, which is up from 7.7 million in 2020. The proportion has got much better. In the West, the moral panic and poor policy response of the 1980s has been replaced by containment and increasing acceptance of a group, gay men at least, who are seen as desirable consumers in a capitalist society. And by saying that, what I mean is that if you look at LGBTQ groups, it is gay male households which tend to be above average incomes, whereas most of the rest are below average incomes. This rainbow capitalism, if you like, creates the very visible, chasing after the pink pound or the pink dollar or even the pink rupee that you see in India in 2018 after homosexuality was decriminalised. All these companies suddenly coming out of the woodwork and proclaiming how pro-gay they were, despite their very poor records in some cases of employing members of the LGBTQ communities. Meanwhile, in Africa, the collapse of whole communities and countries and societies, which the US Vice President Al Gore had warned of in 2000, has not happened. AIDS has not been contained, but societies have rubbed along with it, and the world's media pay it little attention. But the crisis in sub-Saharan Africa and the resulting death toll has not gone away. We started off this talk with the warning, silence equals death, as popularized in the US in the late 1980s. But the urge to sweep things under the carpet and to dismiss the suffering that was very visible on the floor of Congress in the early 1980s was by no means confined to America. The picture here is of Henke Hager Carlson, just after he won his case for unfair dismissal. He'd worked as a bartender in Norway. This illustrates that in 1988, fear of contagion was still being used as an excuse for discrimination by employers. Carlson, sadly, died a few weeks later, just one of the nearly 33 million and counting to do so. The scarring effect this has had on gay communities galvanized activists and helped to establish their humanity as respectable middle-class men became AIDS activists and mobilized the politics of shaming. For instance, the leaflets scattered in the New York Stock Exchange in 1989, "We die while you make money." Such activities were deliberately constructed to draw attention to their plight and indeed the profiteering of drug companies. The result has been differential effects across what has subsequently become known as the LGBTQ plus community. I'm not going to get into the alphabet soup of all the different initials used. Opening out, usualizing for one part of this community has not had the same effects for all. Indeed, in parts of the US, the gentrification of middle-class gay men has brought to an area has diluted the queer enclaves and cities to which LGBTQ plus people used to gravitate, and made them unaffordable for poorer elements in those communities. Yet in the West, AIDS nevertheless was a turning point of sorts, changing the place of those who do not conform to heteronormative society, if only by forcing the activists out of the closet.